You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm Aaron Whiteman, co-director of the Cornell Maple Program at Cornell University. Joining me, as always, is my co-host and indefatigable North Country colleague, Adam Wild. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Aaron. It's great to be back for another episode of Sweet Talk.
Yeah, and I'm glad you were able to join me, especially after our webinar this week that you almost missed because you were stuck driving in a snowstorm.
Yeah, the weather has changed up here in the Adirondacks, and it looks like winter has arrived and here for the season.
Well, that's unfortunate for you. But the weather has changed in central New York, too. Fortunately for me, Ithaca has lots of arts and cultural events to enjoy during the cold months.
Well, I did have a nice hike in the snow with my family this weekend. I don't always envy you living in Ithaca, but I know that's one of the benefits of living in a college town.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things I love about this area. This past weekend, I saw a modern retelling of the Iliad at the theater, and it was incredibly thought-provoking and moving.
Should we pause for a second for you to really reflect on that more, or what's the story of the Trojan War?
Yeah, it's the story of the Trojan War. It's a story about ancient Greece. And what I find so thought-provoking about works like this is the nuance. It's not just good guys versus bad guys like a Hollywood action movie. The characters, like Achilles and Hector, they're complex, and they have both virtues and flaws.
That is a good point. Not everything in life is binary or black and white, but I do have to ask, what the heck does this have to do with maple?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. And I know that was a big windup, but here's what I'm getting at. Today, we're going to talk about late season maple flavor. And sometimes we think about syrup flavor in somewhat binary terms. It's either good and it's grade A, or it's bad and it's processing grade. However, flavor is a really complex experience that involves all of our senses, along with the influence of biases our brains introduce based on past experience and expectations, etc., etc. So, in other words, there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah, that is pretty fascinating to think about. And since flavor is an important part of the appeal of maple syrup, sugar makers and the maple industry as a whole can really benefit from understanding flavor as we try to get the most value out of our crop.
And one question I've had for a long time is whether we're getting the most value out of our late season syrup, especially that slightly punchy, very dark, and slightly buddy syrup we often make the last couple weeks of the season. To learn more about the nuances of flavor and the market potential of these syrups, I interviewed food scientist and manager of the Cornell Sensory Center, Alina Stelick.
I know Lena has been doing a lot of research into this topic, so let's have a listen.
Greetings, Sweet Talk listeners. Today I'm joined by Alina Stelick from the Department of Food Science at Cornell University, and she's here to talk about her research on consumer perceptions of late season maple flavors. Welcome, Alina.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. Let me introduce myself. So my name is Alina Stelick. I run Sensory Evaluation Center here at Cornell in the Department of Food Science. I've been with Cornell in this role for about 10 years now. And before that, I have master's in food science from Cornell. So I'm an alumni that came back to work here. But before that, I worked for large companies in the CPG area. Never in food industry, but more beauty products and personal care products, etc., but always in the sensory and consumer insights role. So I did it for about 11 years. And I have a bachelor's degree in food science as well. And currently I am pursuing my PhD because I figured I am at the university, so I might as well join the ranks of many grad students that are here and learn something in addition to working.
Great. That's so interesting. And can I just ask about this pathway in life that led you to the sensory sciences? Because it's such a fascinating field. I wonder what attracted you to this area of study.
Well, so it's kind of a little bit of a long journey, but when I was in Oregon State for my bachelor's degree in food science, I was really into food chemistry. And so I thought that I would work for, some sort of flavor house, et cetera, developing these new flavors and really getting into the chemistry side of things. But then I took a toxicology class that was kind of required if you also are minoring in chemistry as a food science major. And that scared me a little bit. like, ooh, too scary. And as a senior, I took this class with Dr. Mina McDaniel from Oregon State, and she was just very fascinated as a professor. And she was really into the consumer bit, and her whole thing was that we as a scientist need to make products better for consumers. So our job is to make lives better. And the way that you do that is you test the products and make sure that you weed out the ones that are not good ones. Because the business side of anything, you always want to make more money and you want to, sell stuff to consumers. But sensory, you are that piece of protection. You can tell the business, well, this product is not well liked. You guys are not going to make money.
Mm-hmm.
So don't sell this. So I took the class and I was very fortunate that we had a former alumni of Dr. Mina McDaniel came and did a talk in class, and not just that you can evaluate food products, but she talked about non-food because at the time she worked for S.C. Johnson Company, the household cleaners company. And that was really fascinating to me as well. So I decided I like talking to people. I want to make lives better. And it is still sciencey. There's a lot of math and statistics that are required. It's still chemistry because you need to understand what's happening in the matrix of the product, but it's less scary.
And so now you're the manager of the Cornell Sensory Evaluation Center. So what type of work do you do in that role?
So working at Cornell is really great because, in my role, I deal a lot with students and I help them conduct their research projects. And their research projects can be very different across different food categories. And you help folks learn about different methods and how you would approach experimental design, etc. But at the same time, I deal a lot with commercial clients who contract our services. And this way, we also help commercial clients improve their consumer product offering.
So if I was a small commercial food company and I was trying to improve a product and I had 2 new versions of my product, how could you help me with that?
So if you are a small company, you may not have resources in your own business to run a test. So we are able to provide a facility where we can have a group of folks, at least 100, would taste your product. They would not know that this is your product. And those people would be able to provide an unbiased opinion. And this is very valuable because typically if a small company comes in, it's mostly they get feedback from their friends and family who are, of course, love their product and think it's going to conquer the market because, their friend is doing this, right? So that's the greatest. But we provide a little bit of that separation. And we also, there's a certain art and expertise on how you ask questions and conduct the test that it is unbiased. So you'd be able to test your products. We'll generate lots and lots of data for you, numerical data. You'll be able to compare the means and say you are significantly better than your previous version or your competitor, whatever you want to do. And we also will give you ideas of what consumers want, what they want to improve.
So in lay terms, would it be fair to call these sensory evaluations taste tests?
That is correct. Yes. Taste test is more of a colloquial term.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of folks think that it's simple, going to the tasting at the grocery store, right? So I don't know if folks are doing tastings. I think COVID killed a lot of that. But before COVID, you can go to the grocery store and they'll give you, try this dip and that dip, how wonderful that is. And now, you can buy it. The tests that we do here are a little bit more sophisticated. Again, there is a lot of controls. So each participant is evaluating samples in specific order, and that order is randomized across everybody. So we are eliminating a lot of biases because usually if you try something, initially you like it a lot because it's, something new. And then if you try something at the end, it's also you like it a lot because, oh, thank God the test is over. They stopped asking me questions about it, and I can go. So we randomize order of presentation. We typically also present samples in blinded containers, so you don't know the exact identity of it versus, if you were in the grocery store, you'll see the brand and the logos and maybe information about the product that you're testing, and that can create some biases as well. And the way that we ask questions, we don't say, how did you like this product? Because that implies that you have to say that you liked it. I mean, they assume that you liked it.
Mm-hmm.
So we would say something like, thinking about this product, what do you think? What's your opinion? So it's kind of neutral way of asking questions. So there's a lot of science and art goes on in this, but taste tests, yes, sort of.
I will share for our listeners' benefit that I have worked with you on these studies before. And as someone without a background in sensory sciences or food science or anything, I was actually a little bit surprised at the difference between the informal taste testings that we would do in the sugar house sometimes and the much more rigorous tests that you do in this sensory program. The data you get from those is just so much more valid. And I would have a lot more confidence in what you do than anything I would ever do in the future with just sharing samples with friends to see what they think of it.
Yeah, this is a good segue about testing in the sugar house.
Yeah, so let's talk about your research. So you mentioned earlier that you're also a PhD student doing work basically in the same area around sensory sciences, and your work is around late season maple flavors, right?
Yes, that's correct. Maybe we can start kind of talking about what late season maple flavor is or how other people describe it. So late season maple flavor is described from the literature, and this is before I started doing my research. It was described from the literature as from very pleasant Tootsie Roll kind of flavor, so very sweet, creamy, maybe a little chocolatey or a little bitter. And it can range all the way to becoming very unpleasant and sulfury, kind of a cabbagey off flavor. And the challenge for maple producers, I think that is, you can't really predict from how the sap tastes how your resultant syrup will taste. And my objective was really trying to understand how variable these flavors are in real products. Would they be described in this way? And what consumer attitude, if they try samples of different syrups that might be created later in the season, would they like them? Would they not like them? Would it be something that they would buy?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a broad objective of the PhD project, to deep dive into these different off flavors.
Right. So in other words, we're talking about the syrup that's made at the very end of the season, usually the last couple of weeks. It's usually really dark, and then it starts to manifest these, what we usually eventually call off flavors. It gets to the point where we say this is no longer good for grade A. And you were looking at what consumers really think of that, which I think is a really fascinating question, because we assume as maple producers, we make this, we say, okay, this is no good anymore. Consumers don't like this, which is kind of a simplistic way to look at it. So you're diving deeper into that question, right?
Yes. So we wanted to look at, because the maple industry, there are specific grades and there's definitions for what each grade should look like. From the color standpoint, from the consistency standpoint, sugar content, the bricks level, it has to meet. So there are general guidelines that the government puts out there that the industry has to follow. But what is it based upon?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just sort of historical data that 100 years ago or 150 years ago, as an industry, we decided that this is what should be considered the best quality, and therefore consumers would buy that?
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed? We don't know. So I wanted to look into that and do a bigger deep dive into this area.
Okay. So maybe if I could just tease that question apart a little bit before we dive into your findings. Is the question then whether or not, for example, Buddy syrup is objectively bad, or is it a matter of just consumers have expectations of what syrup should taste like, and then they taste buddy syrup and it falls short or doesn't meet their expectations, and that's why they don't like it? Is that more of the question? Or if they don't even know what they're tasting and they just tried buddy syrup, they might like it if they don't have those expectations? Is that kind of part of what you're looking at?
Yes. So buddy syrup specifically, I don't think consumers have ever seen, because as a producer, you're only allowed to sell in retail space the grade A product. So the buddy syrup, if it's a subgrade, then a producer would sell it and it will be blended, and then it will end up as the maple flavor in somebody's cookies or cereal, et cetera, et cetera. But with that comes also the discount on the pricing of the product. I wanted to look at just exposing maple syrup users to different types of maple syrup that may be not classified as grade A and that were collected across the season, and get their feedback. And we worked with Cornell Maple Program, and you guys have provided us really great variety of maple syrups from 2 different locations, the 2 test sites that you guys had. And that was wonderful. And the variety that was given to us was, we obviously had grade A, great examples of grade A. And then we had samples graded as sour, buddy, and kind of dark and acrid. So like beyond the dark grade A syrup, these had, more of flavors that a professional picked up. And we included sour into this, not just buddy, because sour off flavor can happen at the end of the season when the sap starts to ferment a little bit, but you may not notice it. And then you get these sour flavor notes in your resultant product. So we wanted consumers to experience this whole gamut of variety of flavors.
So did these panelists know they were tasting maple syrup?
We did tell them that they were tasting maple syrup.
Okay.
And we had 2 different studies that we conducted. The first one was called descriptive analysis, so quantitative descriptive analysis study. And for this one, we trained a group of panelists who we previously pre-screened for their sensory acuity, meaning that we knew that they could pick up different flavors. We trained them to rate intensities of particular attributes. For example, they were able to distinguish, different sweetness level and rate it accurately, that if we gave them a stronger sugar solution, they would rate it as having higher sweetness versus a weaker sugar solution, they would rate it as lower sweetness. So these folks were trained. We knew that they could pick up the flavors, and we tasted all the different samples, grade A, sour, buddy, dark and acrid, and generated lexicon. How would you describe these? Are these the same maple syrup products? Do they taste differently? In what way they taste differently? And we came up with a series of attributes. There was quite a long list of attributes. So it wasn't just maple syrup tastes mapley and sweet, but it also had like these dark brown sugar notes, toasted. It had, of course, the maple sweet note, but the other samples, like the buddy samples, also started to have more fruity notes. So like dry brown fruit, like raisins and prunes. Some of them would have this note. Some of them would taste more like molasses, so they would have a little bit more vegetal note.
Okay, so you did this work to better detail the flavor profile of what we would simply call, for example, buddy or sour, because there are multiple flavor notes within that.
Yes.
And that way you can see how consumers react to those different flavor attributes, or what's the use of that type of flavor map type analysis?
So what the descriptive analysis data allowed us to do was to create a perceptual map of the maple syrup as it's collected across the season. And what we found was that there were some similarities between the grade A and some of the sour and buddy syrups that were collected in the mid-season than the sour and buddy syrups that were collected at the end season.
Okay,
So there was
I see.
so we found some gradation that just because a professional grader marks it as buddy, it does not mean that there's no spectrum to that. There is a large spectrum of, how the flavor can manifest itself.
So a syrup in mid-season could have both good flavor attributes and have some buddy flavors on top of that.
That's right.
And then later in the season, some of those good flavor attributes disappear, so the buddy is more prominent.
That is correct.
But they could be equally buddy, like have the same amount of buddy, but a different amount of the other flavor attributes.
Yes.
Okay.
So the grader, so if you are in the industry and in your sugar house, your grader might say, this batch is buddy. We're starting to detect buddy flavor here, so you have to set it aside. You can't no longer sell it as grade A. But the proportion of that happening may be more to the late season. So there's a different intensities of buddy notes that can happen depending on where in the season you're collecting your sample. So descriptive gave us this perceptual map and allowed us to kind of figure out that there's a spectrum of buddiness that exists. And some of it is quite close to the grade A sensory profile. So then the second step that we did was we took the same samples and asked consumers, did they like them? And the reason why we did it in this way and had two separate groups of people, so one sort of descriptive panel doing the work as far as trying to characterize the samples and having a consumer group where we asked the liking, was because our trained panelists, they're trained. So they're not really consumers of maple syrup. We treat them more as a, pH meter, an instrument.
Right. So what did the consumer panelists find?
That was very interesting. So we had about 85 consumers that we pre-screened to be maple syrup users. So they regularly would buy maple syrup. And what we saw was kind of interesting because they also liked some of the milder buddy samples, similarly to how they liked their grade A syrup. And that was unexpected. Now, if it was too buddy, it became too sour, too sulfury, or too bitter, that was disliked.
Okay. So what does that tell us about buddy syrup, for example? Does that tell us that there might be some untapped value to that as a product? How does that tease out in the real world, in the marketplace? Do you have any insights into that?
So it's really fascinating, again, because from the regulatory perspective, you're not allowed to sell something that's not grade A as maple syrup. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding. But our research shows that if you have a little bit of the buddy note in the flavor, consumers like it equally well to the grade A product. So maybe you don't call it a grade A maple syrup. Maybe you call it something different and, mark it in a slightly different way. But there is home for this type of product out there in the marketplace. And some people really like it. And we've done some qualitative research where we, instead of just asking people, how much do you like it, we ask them a lot of follow-up questions like, why? So it seems like the consumers, some of them really like variety of flavors and having just, something new and novel, maybe. So there's definite room for some product development and not just setting everything with a slight buddy note aside and saying, now it's just substandard. We can't get much value from it.
So maybe it would be a better position to take on buddy syrup would be, instead of saying that it's bad or inferior to the grade A syrup, instead saying that it's different. So it would have to go to a different market or maybe different uses, but not just say, oh, this is subpar or lesser value. That's maybe not necessarily an accurate thing to say, that it's just lesser value.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely bad stuff out there.
I know that for a fact, yeah.
Yes. But there's this gradation, and I feel like if we want to go more towards a place of, let's say, sustainability or kind of this idea of waste not, culture where it's something that has a little bit of a different twist that might work in a different medium better, then why not? Why not try to develop something and get more value out of it instead of just sort of saying, oh, this is subpar, this goes to animal feed or, whatever venue that it has to go.
Right. If the price is high enough or the value is high enough, then we can make a profit margin and then it makes sense.
Yes, yes. So the studies that I'm talking about, we've done here at Cornell. So this is upstate New York. Everybody is very familiar with the maple syrup product. And maple syrup product itself is very emotional to this area, to the Northeast. Folks would tell me their stories about, sugaring in the wintertime, in the spring where there's nothing else to do, and it was so much fun, and this was my uncle's backyard where we did it, etc. But everybody else out there in US market, so if you're a person in Arizona or you're a person in Texas, you have no idea, or chances are you have no idea what true maple syrup tastes like.
Right.
So you think that it's just pancake syrup, high fructose corn syrup based. And that's very different. And we've done some studies where we ask questions like, what was your ideal maple syrup? So for this area, Northeast, you would get a certain profile. But for folks more National Geographic sample studies that we've done, it would be a little bit different. Like they don't want thin syrup. They want a thicker version because they're used to more to the pancake syrup type.
Right.
What I'm saying is try new things and try to expand and maybe find a place for this type of product that might not be 100% right for the purist, but not everybody is a purist out there.
Right. So we need to get outside of the thought that we have just a consumer base that knows maple syrup and has expectations around flavor, and think more broadly about what is the value of this flavor that we're making that our traditional maple syrup consumers, we don't think they like. I don't know if that's a good way to put it or not. So you looked at Buddy, but you also looked at acrid or really, really very dark type syrups and sour syrups. Did you have the same findings for those two flavor profiles or no?
Yes, very, very similar. So for the sour ones, again, the sour off flavor, it happens when the sap sort of starts to get fermented a little bit. And it's a bacterial contamination that happens, and the resultant syrup, of course, there's no bacteria left there, so it's totally safe. But it has this sour, kind of a citrusy note to it. You can also have a very thick texture. So it could be very thick and slimy texture that could happen. And believe it or not, some people like that. It's just bizarre. Like they would say, because it's sweet, it's a little sour, so that reminds them of candy. And the slimy texture, it's like, wow, this is like fascinated. It's not, because if it doesn't have a pronounced sulfury note, a pronounced bitter, just sort of a chemical-y kind of note, then some folks may like it. With the dark syrup, it was really interesting because I thought, and this was my thinking, was the really light syrup would be most expensive one. And I don't know why I thought that, but it would have the, highest quality if it's still grade A. And the amber syrup obviously would be more preferred to the dark one. But what we found that actually the dark syrup was the most liked in our study. So it even beats the grade A. And that's again because we've tested it with maple syrup consumers who were from Northeast, from upstate New York area. And it was a lot of sort of emotional connections. And I remember when, my uncle did this in the backyard and they did it over the open fire outside.
Right. The stories that come with it. Yeah.
Yes. And if it had a little bit of that smoky note, the best one ever. So beats the grade A beautiful amber just because it has a little bit of emotionality happening there.
Right. I can relate to that growing up as a maple producer and just having those really strong memories that I'm sure make my brain filter my expectations about what maple syrup should taste like or trigger different feelings that are somewhat independent, I guess, of what my tongue is experiencing.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to talk about testing the syrup in the sugar house or
Okay.
tasting the syrup in the sugar house, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So my understanding of the way that the grading is done, it would be done in the sugar house with kind of all the smells, different aroma that comes in as the syrup is being boiled off, and like there's lots of volatiles in the air.
Right. The sugar house is filled with steam. Usually you're standing right next to the evaporator when you do the evaluation. Yeah, that's the setup.
Yes. And so to me, that environment is very difficult, I think, for the grader to pick up I would say, different notes or defects because the environment is saturated with just the different maple flavor, just everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So the sweetness, the caramel notes, etc. So I think it makes it more difficult for the grader to kind of assess the product right there.
Right.
And this may not be related to our findings because I think our graders, again, they did stuff right and they were highly trained. But I know in smaller operations, the space and kind of the expertise can be less available
Mm-hmm.
or not built up yet. So I think it's important for folks to, if they do the grading, maybe go outside the
Right.
sugar house, just
Mm-hmm.
clear their nose, clear their sinuses, and then smell and taste the product. And this is the challenge. I have to say that this is a challenge across different industries. So I work a lot with dairy, and in dairy, there's issues with trying to detect sanitizer in milk during the production. And it's also very difficult for if you're trying to evaluate if there's sanitizer in the milk as you are standing in the milk plant where there's sanitizer everywhere because you
Right.
just
Right.
sanitize.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same idea. So if you can, when grading, if you can just step outside and do the tasting, maybe
Yeah.
there.
I started doing that a number of years ago. I always taste it hot out of the evaporator or fresh out of the batch, but I also take a sample, take it to another room and let it cool. And then at the end of the day, I clear my palate with some water and try the syrup then. It's a totally different flavor
Yeah.
you
Oh, good
detect.
job. But that comes with experience, right? Because you
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of experience doing
Mm-hmm.
this. And if people have examples, keep an example of your good syrup that you think is good, and somebody else maybe confirmed it for you that it's good syrup,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe compare that to whatever is coming out of the line.
Yep, those are really good tips. Tips from the
Yeah.
professional. So,
Yeah.
Alina, before we wrap up here, what are the next research questions that you think should be asked? Are there more questions to follow here?
There's a lot of questions still left because specifically for this portion of the research, we wanted to understand also if folks would pay the same amount of money for a syrup that has slightly different sensory profile versus the grade A. And because we noticed that the samples that were collected in the middle season that had slight defects, they were still highly liked. Where the samples collected at the end of the season, they developed much more pronounced defects and stronger off flavor that were definitely not acceptable to consumers. So we wanted to look at the kind of a time when the samples were collected. We also want to understand what chemical reactions are happening or what changes in biochemistry of the sap that can lead to these off flavors developing in the syrup. And we have another grad student who's working in this realm, and then try to see if we can predict the flavor of the syrup from the sap in some way. Maybe it's looking at the chemical test. maybe pick up something, amplify it so that the producer does not have to spend all the resources, because it is a labor intensive and energy intensive process to develop a product that would not meet consumer expectations.
Okay, so there's currently efforts to make rapid tests for buddy flavor, so something like that, but maybe a broader range, like a rapid test for sourness or something like that also?
Yeah, yes. So if as you collecting the sap, you can maybe test it and
Hmm.
say there's a high chance that this sap is, it's getting sour, even though you cannot taste it yet. So once it's concentrated, maybe it will not be a good product.
Right. I wonder if there is a possible future using similar technology where we could monitor our sap conditions and know if it's turning bad.
Oh, that would be great. That would be wonderful if you can have something, some sort of indicator in the line and say maybe it's, on the southern hill of your forest, that's when there's some, the trees are starting to change
Hmm.
more rapidly, where in the northern side you still can collect and sort of keep those two things separate. Yes, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all these different findings and knowledge and technology come together with sensors and things like that and what we can do in the future based on research like yours.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me and letting me share this. We're hoping that we will have paper coming out soon and we'll have a few more so that, maple producers can use this and improve their livelihoods.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on today and sharing all the information, and thanks for your work in this field.
Thank you.
Well, Adam, what did you think about Alina's research?
Well, Aaron, that was really interesting, and it's clear that sensory science can do a lot to help us understand what consumers think about maple products. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from Elena's research?
Well, excuse me for getting a little wonky here, but in regards to late season flavors, one lesson I learned was this: that when we constrain our method of valuing late season syrup to expectations based on traditional maple flavor, so when we set maple flavor as our baseline, we're probably undervaluing late season maple syrup in a lot of cases. But if we decouple our evaluation of late season maple flavor from expectations around traditional maple flavor, if that makes any sense, then we can see the inherent value that syrup might have in the marketplace. I've met so many people who like buddy syrup. And when I tell maple producers this, sometimes they react as if this is a problem or as if consumers are misguided and need to be educated to understand that buddy syrup is bad. But instead, this should be an opportunity to think more broadly about marketing the many uses of maple. And that includes maple from a wide spectrum of the flavor gradient.
Yeah, I would agree, Aaron. When we think about buddy syrup and we often use that chocolatey flavor for some buddy syrups, like chocolate doesn't sound bad with maple syrup, right? And obviously it's a little different. So some of those flavors can be good. One year it was kind of interesting. At the end of the season, we did a little test boil on the stovetop of some sap to see if it would make decent syrup before we ran it through the evaporator. And that syrup actually tasted like General Tso's chicken or sesame chicken. It was so strange, and it was actually pretty good. If you were looking for grade A, amber color, rich tasting maple syrup, like obviously it wasn't that, but imagine making like some kind of stir fry or sweet and sour sauce with that. It would be really good.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what we're getting at. And that's not necessarily a new concept that the processing grade or the darker syrups can be used as an ingredient. But I feel like since we've adopted the new grade standards, we think about processing grade in a very different way. And there's definitely an opportunity to open our minds back up to a lot of broader uses. But it is important to remember that there are regulations about processing grade, and we can't put it in a bottle and call it grade A maple syrup.
Yeah, it's definitely different, right? It's not the same, but maybe there are more uses and it's marketed in that totally different way outside of your grade A maple syrup, but for different cooking methods or other things.
Yep. So I think there's a lot more work we can do in this space. So listeners, I hope you've gained some food for thought out of this conversation. If you have questions or comments about this episode, please visit our website and click the Sweet Talk tab to find our contact form.
And remember to tune in next time for Sweet Talk, all things maple. Have a sweet day. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.